Hello class, so today we're going to talk about qualitative data analysis. We're going to learn how to take our texts and be able to put them into meaningful findings that we can then discuss in journal articles, or if you ever have to do qualitative data analysis in your job, where maybe you have to do some kind of research, maybe market research or some kind of customer appreciation, exploration, something like that. This is going to be a good way for you to systematically present your findings to whatever party is interested, and you can have some kind of consistency to it so that people can understand how you got your findings. So this is going to be really important stuff when it comes to qualitative research. So the first thing to keep in mind with qualitative data analysis is that when you design your qualitative research, a lot of the design is going to be emergent. And what we mean by emergent is that things are going to be discovered as you go along, and decisions are going to have to be made as you go along. So when findings are emergent, it means that you can't necessarily predict them from the beginning, and you just encounter them as you go through it, and you make decisions as you encounter those things. So one of the implications of that is typically with qualitative data analysis, you start analyzing your data the minute you start collecting it. So you may plan to do, 30 interviews, for example, for a full-on interview study. But after you do your first 1 or 2 interviews, you should start analyzing the data that you have so far. And the reason is that as you start to analyze data, what you can do is you can then start developing more questions to ask to help explore some of these preliminary findings that you have. So then in the next 2 interviews that you do, you can ask some of the same questions that you asked before, but then you can ask these new questions as well to help explore and to help understand what's going on in the situation. So that's one difference between qualitative research and more of the positivistic social scientific research, where you have to treat everybody the same and you have to ask everybody the same question. In qualitative research, you can change your design as you go based on how your findings are developing. And so if you develop a hunch for something, you're welcome to explore that. So qualitative data analysis is usually inductive as well. So remember, we don't necessarily start with concepts and then say, how do these concepts apply here? We, a lot of times, let the data speak to us, and then we let the concepts define themselves. And that's the idea of multiple samplings as well, which is that you may go back. So like, let's say you do those 2 interviews, and then so you have these preliminary findings. So, you still have 28 more to do, but you may do a sample of 3 more and then analyze your data. And then maybe you'll go back to the first 2 people that you interviewed and ask them these new questions and new findings as well. So that's the idea of qualitative research. You can do multiple samplings, and you can adjust your findings, or you can adjust your analysis and explore potential findings as you go along. It's not a one-shot deal like it might be like giving out a survey in quantitative research. And so one other thing to keep in mind about qualitative research then is that you have to stay open-minded to multiple methods, because maybe you started out just doing an ethnography, but as you started observing things and people, you decided that, I really need to do a lot of interviews, because there's a lot of things that I'm seeing that I'm not understanding. And there's this one thing that I'm really seeing a lot that's appearing in my field notes everywhere. I really need to try to understand this, so I should probably try to interview people, okay? So maybe then when you interview people, you're like, you know what? I may need to do some text analysis too, because what these people are saying is this, and to really get the bottom of this, I really need to see this in action. So the idea is that in qualitative research, you might do 2 or 3 methods in one study, depending on where your findings are taking you. So kind of see yourself as like a private investigator. Who's going into a scene and you're trying to get to the bottom of something, or like an investigative journalist, and you're not necessarily tied to just doing one method and sampling everybody once, and then from that one sample, that's it. It's more like you come to the crime scene, you find this evidence, so you explore this evidence, and then by exploring that evidence, you run into this idea, so then you go and interview that witness to explore that idea, and then from that witness, you see what I mean? So it's kind of taking you wherever the data leads you, okay? So you have that flexibility in qualitative research, okay? And as long as you can justify what you did in your study, then you can, it's perfectly fine to do that. So qualitative research is more about justifying what you do, okay? Can you defend what your method is? Can you defend why you decided to interview people? And can you convince people that what you did was the right thing? Then that's a good qualitative researcher. So, with all of that in mind, here's the goal of qualitative data analysis. You're trying to make sense out of data, right? And the typical way is this. First off, you're going to consolidate all of your data into an analyzable text, okay? So let's say you did an ethnography. So what you're going to probably want to do after you've written out all your field notes and journals and notebooks and on back of napkins and whatever else, you're going to want to put all your, you're going to want to type out all your field notes. So that way they can be put into a text, right? And you're probably going to want to do the line numbers so you know where things are in your notes, okay? So it's just like what we did with discourse analysis, basically. You're going to want everything to be in an analyzable text. Same with the interviews. With interviews, what you would probably do is transcribe all of your interviews, right, into an analyzable text, okay? So there, once again, you want to have it where you can see it all in one place and it's easy reference. The next step is reducing it to basic themes and concepts, and I'm going to show you how exactly to do that, how to go from here to here, okay? But basically, when you present research findings, you can't just like, well, here's all my field notes. Feel free to look through all 300 pages of my field notes and you can figure out what happened. What you have to do is say, okay, here's 300 pages of field notes. Here's the basic theme, or here are the basic concepts, okay? So you don't have to read all 300 pages of my field notes. These are the three basic ideas that we get from this. Such and such, such and such, and such and such, okay? So that's the second step. And then what you want to do is interpret those concepts into an intelligible answer to your RQs. So maybe you'll come up with 3 themes from your field notes. So then you go back to your research question and you got to be able to say, here are 3 categories and here's what we can say from these 3 categories in terms of answering my research question, okay? So it shouldn't just be here are 3 categories, it should be here's the answer to my research question based on these common themes that I'm seeing, okay? So consolidate, reduce, and interpret. That's the 3 things that you're trying to do in qualitative data analysis. So the first piece in terms of, we've already know how to consolidate, transcribe, line numbers, all of that. What we now are working on is reducing. So once you've consolidated all your data into a text, something that's very common in qualitative research is this thing called coding, okay? So people are going to say, I need to code my data. And coding is basically just assigning a label to some aspect of your data, okay, for retrieval and observation. So if we have my transcript here from the, police interrogation, coding is all about basically looking through this text and coding any kind of theme, any kind of concept, any kind of observation that I make. Okay, looking at this text, I want to code that. So there's different ways you can code something, okay? So maybe it's like, oops. So maybe, for example, it's like, here's a question. So do you want to talk to us? Okay, so maybe I'll code that as a Q because that's a question, okay? So I'm coding based on questions and statements. This is a statement, okay? Now, I could code it on multiple levels. I could say question. I could also code it as maybe not just Q, maybe like, I don't know, an inquiry, a friendly inquiry. Okay, so do you want to talk to us? That sounds kind of friendly, okay? So maybe I'll code that first sentence as Q and FI, friendly inquiry. Then I know you got some sleep last night, so maybe I'll code that once again as a statement. So I'll put that in blue. Maybe I'll also code it as, I don't know, and I'm just making stuff up here, but you can code it as a friendly statement or something, okay? Maybe you'll code it also as, I know you said you got some sleep last night, demonstrated listening, so I'll call that DL. And then this next sentence, I might code it as well. So I might say, it says, I know you probably want to get this over with. Okay, so that looks like another friendly statement, so I'll code that as an FS, okay? And, maybe just also as a statement as well, okay? So coding is all about what do you see here and doing it for everything in the data, okay? So here, my basic unit of analysis was statements, but depending on my research question, I might code at different levels, okay? So if my research question is like, if it's not statements and questions, like what do people say, maybe it's like, how do people exert friendliness in police interrogations or something? Then maybe it might be the whole turn. Is this whole turn friendly? And so then at that point, I would code this whole turn here. And let me use a different color so you can see that. So maybe I'll code this as red, as like a friendly turn, because I'm interested at the turn level. So that's where basic unit of analysis that we talked about a few weeks ago, that's where that's going to come into play, because you want to make sure you code at the level that your research questions are, okay? But you'll code everything, okay? And so coding is all about assigning labels to observations that you make in your data, okay? And then what you can do, how often does FS appear, how often does S appear, DL appear, and all the codes that you make, that's the basis for creating categories, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So whenever you think of qualitative coding, okay, and just qualitative data analysis in general, think of groceries, okay? So imagine that these groceries here are data, okay? And so if I were to ask you to code it, there's a lot of ways that you could code this, and there's a lot of ways you could categorize this as well. So in this picture, for example, if we were to try to categorize these groceries, there's a lot of ways we could do it. We could do it by maybe dairy products, right? So here's some dairy products. There's some butter in the background, milk. Then maybe we'll categorize it by dairy products, and then, fruit products. So there's the fruit right here, and maybe we'll categorize it by, and then the other category that appears, wheat products. So let me use a different wheat products, and then maybe like desserts or something, okay? So that's one way that you could categorize it: dairy, fruit, wheat, that sort of thing. But depending on your interests, you might code it a different way and categorize it a different way. Maybe you'll do, maybe you'll do natural products and synthetic products. So maybe it's just two different things. So your natural products would be like the apples and the bananas, and that looks like pretty much it. I guess milk, eggs are natural, orange juice, we'll call that natural, and milk, it's not synthetic, I guess. And then maybe you'll just have two categories, which that would be kind of simplistic, but everything else is natural. You could code it by healthy, unhealthy. You can code it by high sugar, low sugar. You could code it by, generic products, name brand products, local products. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can categorize these groceries. So it's all a matter of what is most applicable to what you're trying to understand, okay, in terms of your research question. So your research question is a very much guiding principle in terms of how you're going to code things and how you're going to categorize things, okay? If I'm asking about how much carbs do people have in a typical grocery list or something, I don't know, then you probably want to do like high carbs, low carbs, something, or what kinds of groceries do people buy? You can do, dairy, fruits, grains, juices, sodas, salts. So it's all about what is your research question. Okay, so there's 4 steps to constructing a category, and we're going to go through each. So the first step is open coding. So this is assigning, labeling observations to parts of your data, regardless of whether you think it's pertinent to your research question or not. So going back to my transcript, for some reason I forgot to attach it as a picture here, but that's okay. You're going to code you're going to code everything, okay? The reason why is just, for all you know, there could be something that you could be missing. And it's just a more inductive way of looking at things, because sometimes if you're just like, I'm just going to look for instances of face work, you might miss things that you didn't think were face work, but are still interesting to understanding how face work might work, okay? So open coding is all about labeling any and all observations that you see, regardless if it's pertinent to your research question or not. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that you do this with just a small portion of your data first, okay? So, let's say you have, 30 pages of data. You would just do this on page 1 and 2, okay? So you wouldn't open code everything right away. So then step 2 is what we call axial coding. And this is where you start to consolidate your codes into groups according to a common thread or theme among them, okay? So let's say I have my transcript once again. And, let's say, I have all these different codes that I'm finding, in the transcript. Okay. So what axial coding is basically saying is, okay, so here's a common code that's in my research. Here's something that's, out there. Here's another thing that's out there. Here's another thing out there. Axial coding is basically taking this and grouping these. What's the common theme among these codes that I'm seeing? So maybe, for example, I'll say code A and code B seem to go together as a group, So code A and code B then begin to form what we call a category, potentially, okay? And then maybe I'll be like, well, code A and code C and code D are very different. So maybe these are possible categories as well, okay? But here, this is the open coding. Here, this is the axial coding, okay? Now you're coding the codes, essentially, and starting to find the common threads among them. Then, you have the comparison stage, okay? So going back to, your 4 different codes, okay, let's just say, 2 of them were in the group, okay, and disregard what colors I use. Just regard the fact that there's 4 different codes, and 2 of them are in one category and 2 others are in other categories. So comparison is where you take these code groups, okay, and you apply them to another set of your data. So remember I said you only do open coding on like the first 2 pages, and then you start to do your axial coding. So then let's say on pages 3 and 4, okay, now you apply these code groups, okay, to pages 3 and 4, all right, and then you try to look for examples of these groups in pages 3 and 4. And so hopefully from pages 3 and 4, you can start getting more examples of your codes and groups. And what you might also discover in pages 3 and 4 is maybe there's another group that's potentially can be a code as well, okay? So maybe page 3 has something that you didn't see in page 1 and 2, just as you read through the data. So then you may discover another group. So then you go to pages 4 and 5, and then you do the same thing again, okay? And you try to see if you can fill more of your groups with examples from page 4 and 5, and you're seeing if these code groups actually apply to other places in your data besides page 1 and 2, okay? So does that make sense? So you start with codes, then you have axial coding, then you have comparison coding. And so I already said that. Okay. Then you have the 4th step, which is categorization. So this is where you identify the conceptual elements that cover most or all of the examples in your group, okay? So once you have a code group, okay, so these are all examples within that group, okay? Categorization is basically figuring out what is the thing that binds all this? Okay, so what's the tie that binds it? What's the concept that's gluing all this together? And gearing it towards your research question. Okay, and how does it answer your research question is the idea. Okay, so a category is basically the glue that ties a bunch of examples together that help you answer a research question. Okay, and so you do the same thing with your other group. Okay, your other code group. What is it that brings all of these little examples together? And what is like the concept or the theme? And what is it in terms of the RQ? Okay, so that's categorization. And that's how you make sure that your codes are reliable, okay? That they're actually good codes and they're actually good groups and concepts because you keep applying it to new instances of data instead of doing it all at the end and you don't really know if like this would apply to other sets of data, okay? So there's 3 ways to categorize once you have these categories, okay? So you can do it in chronological order. So you can think of your categories as being different points in time in a narrative. So you can say, people begin the conversation by doing these few things. Then in the next set of categories, this is how they go about, you know, maintain the conversation. This is how they close the conversation, okay? So you can orient your categories chronologically. You can orient your categories conceptually. So you can just organize them into larger concepts, okay? So there's 3 common concepts that appear in police interrogations. It's not open, middle, close. It's friendliness, politeness, and understanding, or something like that, okay? So that's a conceptual categorization. Or, and the best kind of categorization to do is theoretical, where you organize the categories into models, theories, or heuristics. So what you might say is, in this category, you know, and of codes, this actually leads to this, you know, and this actually causes either this, you know, or that, you know, and if that happens, you get this again. You see what I mean? So that's theoretical. So theoretical is basically, instead of just classifying things, we're explaining the relationship between things, and that's what good findings do. Good findings just don't classify, they explain the relationship between 2 things. See, science is all about starting with classification, right? So like if you look at like astronomy, you know, the first thing they try to do is they identify the planets, right? But that's not it. It's not just identifying planets. What they also try to do is figure out the relationship between the planets, right? So here's a planet. So what's the relationship between planet A and planet B? You know what I mean? And that's what good findings do. They just don't tell us that there's stuff out there. They tell us the relationship between stuff out there and the relationship between us and it and other things, okay? So that's the level you really want to be at when you're doing qualitative research. What's the relationship between these categories, okay? Not just what are they, but also what's the relationship between them? How do they behave, okay? So 5 aspects of good categories. They should be responsive to the purpose of the research. So even when you do open coding, not everything that you code will be useful to your research question, but it might be insightful if, you know, to help answer it potentially. But if not, then you leave those findings out, but then that becomes another paper, another research question that you can tackle later on. They should be exhaustive. So your category should cover all of something. So if I'm saying what kind of face work is being done in police interrogations, my categories better cover all of the known instances of face work in the data, okay? So like if I have 5 categories, but there's still this other instance of face work that appears, but I'm not mentioning it, then my categories aren't exhaustive. So I need to make sure that whatever categories I come up with, they can explain all of the cases of the concept that you're interested in, okay? So they got to be exhaustive. They should be mutually exclusive. So your categories should be mutually exclusive in the sense that there shouldn't be one instance of face work that can fall under 2 categories. If your categories are well defined enough, it should be the case that an instance of something should neatly fit into one category and not fit into 5, okay? So that's how you know when you've done good categories. Every instance of something fits into one neatly and not into any others. Your categories should also be sensitizing, okay? So your categories shouldn't just be labels, first set of findings, second set. Your categories should be insightful, right? Like they should tell us something by just looking at your findings and the names of your categories or your themes and the concepts that you bring up. This should mean something, okay? So you just don't want to put like polite practices, you want to put like using compliments, is a little bit better, right? The use of compliments. And you can do kinds of compliments, using face compliments, using physical compliments, that kind of thing. And your category should be conceptually congruent, okay? And the basic idea here is your categories should be on the same level, okay, in terms of analytic insight, okay? So you should have, if your categories are theoretical in nature, if you have 2 categories that are theoretical, then your third one should be theoretical too, okay? They should be conceptually congruent, speaking on the same level. You don't want like a category that's talking about one specific instance of something, and then you have 2 other categories that are talking about general broad practices of something, okay? So you want to make sure that they're all on the same level of analysis, okay? If they're all theoretical categories, so if you're trying to talk on a theoretical level, then all of your categories need to be theoretical in nature. If you're trying to talk more like specific instances of something, then they all need to be on the specific instance level. They need to be conceptually congruent, okay? So those are the 5 aspects. In conclusion, being in qualitative research is like being a private investigator. So it's not a one-shot deal when you do your studies where you can only sample your data once, and whatever you do in that sample, you have to be consistent with everybody. You have to do the same thing all times. Nope, you get to, if you get a lead on something, you're welcome to explore that lead. You're welcome to go back to your sample, ask them more questions, all kinds of neat things. The big thing with qualitative research that most people struggle with is just moving beyond the no-duh findings. So what you have to understand is like, people, when you put out research questions, a lot of times, people who read these, especially really smart people, they'll try to predict the answer. And so when you can look at somebody's research question and you pretty much already know the answer without, like you already have like a pretty common sense answer to it without even having to look at the data. And then you prove that person right with very common sense answers. It's just kind of like, oh, well, that was kind of lame then because it didn't really surprise me, right? So you want to really, what you want to try to do in qualitative research is one of the best quotes I ever heard was, good qualitative research makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So even if you're doing something that's familiar, okay, something that's very common, what you want to try to look for, what are the strange things about this, or in what ways can this thing actually be strange, okay? And the same thing with the strange, right? How is this really strange thing actually not so strange after all? How is it actually pretty familiar to what we normally do in everyday life? It may seem strange at first, but what these findings show is actually no different than what we're doing in our everyday lives, okay? So you got to move beyond just the no duh, okay? So you got to ask good research questions that set you up to then come up with answers to questions that if I read your research question, I shouldn't be able to predict the answer, right? Like I should be, I don't know. Or if I do predict the answer, hopefully the answer is wrong, okay? Because you found something insightful. So qualitative research is very time consuming. It's one of those things where you could spend months in the field, years even in the field, before you even produce a study, or an article, okay? So that's the trade-off. Quantitative research, you may not have to spend 8 years in the field. You may be able to churn something out maybe in a year, but you also get kind of more of a broad level of insights about things. Qualitative research, very precise, very insightful, but it takes a damn long time, okay? So that's the trade-off, okay? So I think that should give you an idea of what qualitative data analysis looks like. And for this week, if you want to do a qualitative data analysis for extra credit, you can. If not, this at least shows you what you need to know if you were to go to the next level of qualitative research. And if you get a master's or a PhD, you'll definitely learn more about how to do qualitative research in depth You will take individual classes on each of the methods, so you'll become an expert in each, or at least pretty good at each, and that'll get you set for wherever you want to go in the future. Okay? Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to your assignments.